Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, we're going to be looking at something that's caused a lot of debate and confusion over the years, the U.S. Electoral College.
Yeah.
Yeah, the thing that actually picks the president. It's not a simple popular vote system like a lot of people think it is. And today we're going to be trying to figure out why exactly that is and explore like all the history and the mechanics of it. So I've got a real expert with me here today who can hopefully unpack all this for me and answer some questions I've got about this whole thing. I'm sure you've got a lot of the same questions too. So let's just jump right into it. Can you give us a super quick summary of what the Electoral College even is and like why it exists?
Sure. The Electoral College is a group of people. There's 538 of them, and they're called electors. And it's their votes that decide who's president and vice president of the United States. To win, a candidate needs at least 270 of these electoral votes. So the reason this whole system exists goes way back to the Founding Fathers and the Constitution. Back in 1787, they had a lot of concerns back then. Like, they didn't really trust that the average voter would be able to make informed decisions. And they also wanted to balance the power between bigger states and smaller states.
Oh, that's really interesting. So it wasn't just about like making a fair system. It was about like figuring out how to manage political power too, right? You mentioned that the Founding Fathers were worried about voters making informed decisions. Was that like a common thought back then?
Oh, yeah, definitely. You got to remember, this was a totally different time. Communication was super slow. Access to information was really limited. And like widespread education wasn't really a thing yet. The Founding Fathers were basically worried that a direct popular vote would mean people would make decisions without knowing all the facts, or that some really charismatic but unqualified person would manipulate the voters.
Okay, so they made the system of electors to basically act as a kind of safety net. But how are these electors actually picked, and how does that connect to the popular vote?
So each state gets a certain number of electors. It's the same as the total number of senators and representatives that state has in Congress. Every state has 2 senators, and the number of representatives is based on how many people live in that state. So bigger states have more electors, like California has 55 electoral votes, while Wyoming only has 3. And here's where the popular vote comes in. Most states have this winner-take-all system. Whoever gets the most votes in a state usually gets all of that state's electoral votes, even if they only win by like a tiny amount.
Wow, that's pretty crazy. I can see how that could lead to some weird results.
Yeah.
I mean, couldn't somebody be president even if they didn't get the most votes across the whole country?
Yeah, you're right. That's actually happened 5 times in U.S. history. The most recent times were in 2000 and 2016. And those caused a ton of controversy and arguments about whether the Electoral College is fair or if it's even relevant anymore. In both of those elections, the person who got more votes overall actually lost the presidency because the other candidate got enough electoral votes.
I mean, that seems like a big problem with the system. I totally get why people would say that's not very democratic.
Yeah.
If the person who got fewer votes can still win.
It's a really good point, and that's one of the main reasons people are against the Electoral College. They say it goes against the idea of one person, one vote, and it gives too much power to just a few swing states.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
So knowing how it works now, I'm even more curious about where it came from. We talked about the Founding Fathers' concerns and everything.
Yeah.
But like, is there more to it than that? Did slavery have anything to do with how the Electoral College was created?
Yeah, it did. And it's a pretty uncomfortable part of the story that we need to talk about. Back then, there was this thing called the 3/5 Compromise. It was part of the Constitution, and it let slave states count 3/5 of their enslaved population towards how many representatives they got in Congress. And that meant they got more electors, too, so they had more power in presidential elections.
Oh, wow. So even though slaves couldn't vote, their existence was basically being used to give more power to slave states. That's a pretty messed up part of the history of the Electoral College.
Yeah, it is. It shows us that the system was made in a totally different time, with different social and political values, back when slavery was still a huge part of life in America. And that makes the whole debate about whether the Electoral College is fair even more complicated.
It makes you wonder about like the long-term effects of those compromises back then and how they've shaped the politics we have today. So you said that electors are divided up based on how many people each state has in Congress. But how are the electors actually chosen? Is it just a direct vote by the people?
Well, it's actually a bit more complicated than that. Each state gets to decide how its own electors are nominated and chosen. Some states do primaries where voters pick their party's potential electors directly.
So it's like a mini election within the bigger presidential election. That's interesting.
Yeah, it is. Other states hold party conventions where delegates choose the group of electors. And some states, like Pennsylvania, let the campaign committees for each candidate choose their own electors. So it's different from state to state.
Wow, sounds like a bit of a mixed bag. You'd think something as important as picking the president would be the same everywhere in the country.
Well, that's kind of the interesting thing about federalism in the U.S. States have a lot of freedom in how they run their elections, and choosing electors is no exception.
Yeah, that definitely adds another layer of complexity to it all. Okay, so let's say it's after Election Day, and we know who won the most votes in each state. What happens then? Do the electors just automatically vote based on those results?
In most cases, yeah. They're usually pledged to vote for whoever won the popular vote in their state. But there's this thing called faithless electors, where an elector might go against that and vote for someone different.
Hold on, really? They can just ignore what the voters want like that?
It's super rare,
Yeah.
but it has happened. And in the past, there wasn't much to stop them. But after a couple of high-profile cases of faithless electors in 2016, the Supreme Court said that states can make laws requiring electors to vote the way they promised.
Okay, so no more messing around with the votes. But even though the electors are supposed to vote a certain way, they still have a whole separate meeting to actually cast their votes, right?
That's right. It's not over till the Electoral College actually votes. That happens in December, a few weeks after the general election. The electors from each state meet up in their state capital, and they vote for president and vice president on separate ballots.
Okay, so this meeting is basically like the final official decision. It seems kind of pointless if they have to vote according to how their state voted anyway.
It's mostly a formality, yeah.
Yeah.
Then the results are sent to Congress, and in early January, there's a joint session of Congress where they officially count up the electoral votes and say who won.
And that's when we finally officially have a new president.
Well, not quite. Inauguration Day is when the new president is sworn in, and that's not until January 20th. But that meeting of Congress is when the Electoral College's decision becomes official, and the results are formally recognized.
It's a long and complicated road to the White House. There's way more going on behind the scenes than I ever realized.
It's a really interesting process, for sure, full of history and tradition, and of course controversy. And we've just scratched the surface.
Yeah, I'm excited to dig into those controversies and really get into the arguments for and against the Electoral College. But first, can you tell me a bit about how this system has changed over time? Has it always been like this? Or have there been like major changes throughout history?
It's definitely not the same as it used to be. The Electoral College has gone through a lot of transformations since it started. In the early days, it was usually state legislatures that chose the electors, not the people. Can you imagine that today? Politicians just deciding among themselves who would be president.
Wow, that's wild. That's so different from how it works now. I bet people would be furious if it was still like that. So when did that change? And how did the system become more about what the people want?
Well, it was a pretty gradual process. As ideas about democracy spread and more people got the right to vote, more and more states started letting their citizens have a say in presidential elections through the Electoral College. By the mid-1800s, basically every state had adopted popular elections for choosing their electors.
Wow, so it's come a long way. So what you're saying is, the Electoral College we have today, even though it's based on that original system, has actually changed to be more democratic and include more people's votes.
Exactly. It shows how our political system can change and adapt over time. But these changes also highlight some of the problems built into the system, like the struggle to balance what states want with what the people want, and how complicated representative democracy really is.
It definitely still causes a lot of arguments today.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's switch gears a bit and talk about the arguments for and against the Electoral College. We've touched on some of them already, but I want to really dig into what people disagree about. So what are some of the strongest reasons people give for keeping the Electoral College the way it is?
One of the biggest arguments is that it forces candidates to try to get a lot of support across the whole country, not just in places with lots of people. They say that a national popular vote would give too much power to big cities, and that rural areas would be ignored.
So it's about making sure that candidates have to appeal to a wider range of voters and consider all the different interests and perspectives across different parts of the country.
Yeah, exactly. People who support the Electoral College say it encourages candidates to build connections across different regions and groups of people. They can't just focus on winning in a few states with huge populations. They have to win states, which in theory means they need to engage with more voters from different backgrounds.
That makes sense. It's about finding a balance between representing what the majority of people want and making sure that different areas of the country feel like they have a voice in the election. What about the argument that the Electoral College protects smaller states? We talked about how a state like Wyoming, with not many people, has way fewer electoral votes than California.
Right. That's another big point people make in favor of the Electoral College. They say that without it, candidates wouldn't bother campaigning in those less populated states or care about their needs. They argue that the Electoral College helps to even things out so that smaller states have a say in who becomes president, which they wouldn't have if it was just based on population.
So it's about preventing a few really big states from having too much power and making sure that every state, no matter how big or small, feels like they're part of the process.
Exactly. They say this system helps to keep a balance of power between the states, which is one of the main principles of federalism in the Constitution. They see it as a way to make sure the president represents the whole country.
And then there's the whole history argument. Some people just think we should stick with what the founding fathers created, even if it's not perfect. Like, it's about respecting tradition and what they wanted for the country.
Yeah, that's definitely part of it. For a lot of people, the Electoral College represents a connection to our history. It's been part of our democracy since the very beginning. And they think changing something so fundamental could be really disruptive and messy.
I get that. But I also think it's important to really look at those traditions and systems, especially when they have clear problems. And speaking of problems, let's talk about why so many people want to get rid of the Electoral College, or at least change it.
The main arguments against it are about fairness and whether it actually reflects what the people want. As we've talked about, it's totally possible for a candidate to become president even if they didn't get the most votes. It's happened 5 times in U.S. history. And every time it's caused a ton of debate and anger.
It just seems wrong in a democracy that someone can be president even though more people voted for someone else. It makes you question if the system is really legitimate and if it actually represents the idea of everyone's vote being equal.
You're exactly right. People who are against the Electoral College say that it basically makes millions of votes meaningless. If you live in a state where almost everyone votes for one party or the other, your vote might not actually matter in the presidential election. And that can make people feel like their vote doesn't count and like they shouldn't bother voting at all, especially in states where the outcome is pretty much guaranteed.
So it's not just about whether the final result is fair. It's about how it affects whether people even want to vote.
Exactly. People who criticize the Electoral College say it creates a system where candidates only focus on a few swing states, and they ignore what voters in the rest of the country want. So not only does it distort campaigns, but it can also lead to lower voter turnout in states that aren't considered competitive.
Yeah, I can see how that would be bad for democracy. If people feel like their votes don't matter, they're less likely to participate. And that can make people lose trust in the whole system.
Exactly. And that brings us to another major criticism, that the Electoral College gives too much power to swing states. Candidates know they can basically ignore states that always vote one way and just focus all their time, money, and energy on a few battleground states, where the vote could go either way. So voters in those swing states have way more influence on who becomes president than voters in other parts of the country.
So it's not just about how the votes are counted. It's about how the Electoral College changes the whole way campaigns are run.
Exactly. Critics say it distorts campaign strategies and leads to candidates only caring about the specific interests of voters in a handful of swing states and ignoring everyone else. They say it creates a system that doesn't truly represent the whole country.
That's a pretty serious criticism. So the Electoral College has a lot of supporters, but also a lot of people who think it's messed up and doesn't fit with how we think about democracy today. Do you think it's likely to change anytime soon?
That's the big question. Lots of people have called for it to be reformed or abolished, but changing the Constitution is really, really hard. You need a supermajority vote in both houses of Congress, and then 3/4 of the states have to ratify it.
Yeah, that's a high bar to clear. But we talked about that National Popular Vote Interstate Compact earlier.
Yeah.
That sounds like a pretty interesting way to get a national popular vote without actually changing the Constitution. Can you remind me how that works?
Sure. It's basically an agreement between states where they promise to give their electoral votes to whoever wins the popular vote nationwide, even if someone else won their state. It's kind of like a loophole.
Oh, so it's like states teaming up to override the current system. That's pretty clever. But do you think it could actually work? How many states have signed on, and what would it take for it to actually happen?
It's definitely gaining traction. Right now, 17 states and Washington, D.C. have joined. That's 195 electoral votes. The compact needs states representing at least 270 electoral votes for it to go into effect.
So they're getting close. What happens if they reach that number? Would the Electoral College basically disappear?
That's the plan, yeah. The idea is that once enough states have joined, Whoever wins the popular vote automatically becomes president. No matter what happens with the Electoral College, it would basically make the current system irrelevant.
Wow, there would be a huge change for American politics.
Hmm.
But I bet there would be lawsuits about it, right? People would definitely question whether that kind of agreement is even allowed.
Oh, absolutely. There are still lots of debates about whether the National Popular Vote Interstate Compact is legal, and if it ever got close to actually happening, there would definitely be big legal challenges. It would be a landmark case. That could potentially change the whole foundation of how we run elections in America.
This is all so interesting. We've learned so much about how the Electoral College works and all the arguments for and against it. It's definitely a system that's deeply rooted in American politics, but it's also facing more and more scrutiny these days.
It's a really interesting idea, and it makes you think about how the Electoral College might be affecting the whole two-party system we have in the U.S.
Yeah, that's a good point. I've heard that before. But I never really understood how those things are connected.
Well, some people say that the winner-take-all system in the Electoral College makes it almost impossible for third-party candidates to win. It's really hard for them to gain any traction or win electoral votes, even if they have a lot of support across the country.
Yeah, I see what you mean. Like if a third-party candidate gets 20% of the vote in a state, they still get 0 electoral votes.
Yeah.
Because only the winner gets everything. So all those votes basically don't count when it comes to the Electoral College.
Exactly. And that kind of keeps the two big parties, Democrats and Republicans, in power. It's super hard for third-party candidates to break through, even if they represent a lot of voters.
So the argument is that the Electoral College doesn't just decide who wins the presidency, it actually shapes the whole political system by making it really hard for anyone besides the two main parties to have a chance.
That's the idea. It makes you wonder if a different system, like a national popular vote, might lead to a more diverse political system with more parties and more choices for voters. It's definitely something to think about.
It definitely adds a whole new dimension to the conversation. We've talked about fairness
Yeah.
and representation and historical tradition, and now the impact on the two-party system. It seems like the Electoral College has a lot of effects that go way beyond just picking a president.
It just shows how connected everything is in politics.
What?
Even little technical things can have huge impacts on the bigger picture. If you want to understand how democracy works in America and how to participate in it, you got to understand the Electoral College, its history, and how it could affect things in the future.
I totally agree. So as we wrap up this deep dive into the Electoral College, I just want to say, it doesn't matter if you support the system the way it is, or if you think it needs to be changed, or even abolished. What matters is that you're informed and you're part of the conversation. The Electoral College isn't just something from the past. It's still shaping our politics today. So to everyone listening, keep learning about this stuff. Read different perspectives. Talk to people who have different views, and figure out what you think. The future of our democracy depends on people being informed and engaged. I couldn't have said it better myself. It's been great being here today. I've really enjoyed having you on the show. And to all our listeners out there, thanks for joining us on The Deep Dive. We'll see you next time.